Violation of consent is mostly our framework for morality. When
Mm.
you violate the consent of those around you, the creatures that are born and have not yet necessarily been born, that's when you commit the greatest crimes. And the degree to which you violate consent decides the punishment that one receives.
Good. And so if you go back in the history of your planet, like has this idea that violations of consent are immoral, have you always thought that? Or was there like a time at which you came to discover that?
Well, a lot like your planet, we started off with a priest class that sort of acted as the intermediary to gods who dictated moral code. But we realized this was sort of insufficient at some point because individuals were always forced to rely on someone else to make decisions.
And there were deep-seated corruptions. The moment that Alvaflacians gave up their agency of understanding and of coming to a decision, you came to realize that there would be a creature external to you who was deciding what was best. And there was this issue with obedience because we found that Alvaflacians would obey without having an understanding of why they obeyed. And so, in order to create a system where morality was more innate, we came to learn how to behave in ways that would allow us to behave morally.
So in in my world, the people who helped us learn that were philosophers. And that's like that's a big part of what philosophy is. Like if I were going to say, what is the single biggest achievement that humans have done over their history? There's many achievements, but I would say number one is the recognition of the existence of human rights. I would say that's the biggest thing human beings have done. We didn't used to understand that there were these rules for how you have to treat people. Now we do. And it was mostly philosophers of one kind or another. And the earlier end, it was sort of religious philosophers. And then later, the kind of, I would say the full development, you'd be hearing someone like Immanuel Kant.
So was that
So
achieved with
it
an
took a long
argument?
time. Yeah, many arguments, not just one, and it took a long time. Right. It was an idea that was bigger than the people who were developing it. And in a lot of ways, we are still working it out. We are still coming to understand even that something like, what is wrong with racism? Why is it important that gay people be allowed to marry? Those are, I take it, kind of extrapolations of this idea of human rights that it's like we haven't fully squeezed all the juice out of it yet. We're still working on it. So it's not one person, it's many people, but um, but
Was it
it wasn't a thing that was obvious from the start.
was it derived multiple times in different cultures?
So I don't know about all of those. Like I know about one cultural tradition, um, and even that I don't know all of it. But I would say that you know the dominant thread is through sort of Christianity and then the Enlightenment, right? Where yeah, I think that um, the I mean, there's a version of it in Homer too. Like it just depends on um, how like open-minded you're going to be about counting something as an incipient version of an idea, right? Um, but but there's this idea that there's something kind of inviolable and dignified um, that belongs to at the start just every human being, right? Then there are questions about other non-human animals. Um, and it has a lot of different manifestations. There's a weird manifestation of it in Plato, where I think at certain points it almost seems like what he thinks is that human beings are gods. They're mortal gods, gods who can die. Um, and so that's why we have to respect one another, because there's something divine in us. And I think you do have that in Christianity. There's something divine in the human. But then eventually I think it gets articulated, in the form of liberalism, this idea that there's a kind of basic, like, non-interference that we should have with respect to one another. So it's a little bit like your consent idea, right? So by the time you get to say mill or something, like the idea is that there's a sphere of freedom that part of what it is for me to be a human rational creature is that there's a sphere of freedom that I have to act in certain ways and to not be interfered with.
And that began
really
with liberalism?
No, I would say liberalism is sort of how is the kind of final articulation or late articulation of that, right?
I see.
That is the idea that a human being has a kind of like, dignity and preciousness and divinity. You can find that in Homer, you can find it in Plato, right? And where that idea has very little to do with non-interference. So it develops into that thought about non-interference. Yeah.
I see.
And is this a sort of species level aspiration, do you figure? You speak of aspiration on the level of individuals, but it seems like a question of human rights is something that happens on a larger scale than just an individual. And so is it possible for an entire species to aspire to something?
Yeah, I mean, this is a question I asked myself, and I myself felt it was a lacuna in my book that I didn't know the answer. I think that if there are species-wide aspirations, then something like the domain of knowledge and is one of the areas in which those aspirations occur, right? Like our hunger to understand the way the world works and the way we ourselves work is like bigger than what can fit in a lifetime. And so, yes, I think there is something like that. And people have even a kind of sense that they're going to die without, themselves getting to the answer. So it's a bit like Moses, who gets to look over and see the promised land, but he can't enter it. So I think there is something like that, but I haven't myself produced a theory of how that works, like how it's possible to be part of an aspirational project that you will never see to the end of.
It's also interesting in your book, you talk about the difference between ambition and aspiration. And Quinn's question just now sort of opens up the idea that perhaps self-preservation is a primary motivator, and the aspirational aspect is secondary for some folks.
Do you mean on a species level too?
Yeah, on the species level.
Interestingly, I think even with respect to moral aspirations, some people can think of them sort of ambitiously, like take eliminating racism. Okay. I think the way a lot of people think of that is, I know exactly what it would be for there to be no racism. I'm just not sure how to bring that about. Or maybe I even know how to bring it about, but I don't have the tools or I can't force people, or I can't whatever, right? Or maybe I do know, and I'm going to try and do it. Right? That would be an ambition. It wouldn't be aspiration, because I understand exactly what the valuable state is, right? And it's just like we're not there yet.
So aspiration is about discovering the value.
Exactly. It's that you see, the value, like the coming to value as itself a learning process, right? Where it's like someone like Mill, he wrote about the subjugation of women. He was one of the people who's starting to see that the basic ideas of human rights and liberalism entailed different views about, how we think about gender than what existed in his time, right? He's like, we need to think about this differently. But he certainly didn't get to the bottom of all the other issues that we have to also think about differently once we, embrace certain aspects of liberalism, right? So it was like, there was still a lot of learning left to do, and there was a lot of learning left to do sort of pre-Mill, certainly, right? So there it's like there are moral realizations or forms of moral awakening that hadn't happened yet. One question you might have is like, do we still have those to look forward to? And I suspect we do. And those are very hard to anticipate. But people in the future will look back at us and say, wow, they were really morally screwed up in all these ways.
Do you have a sense for what those would look like? Like when you go through your life on a day-to-day basis, are there moments that you look around and flash into a future that hasn't happened yet, where you consider the ways in which you were complicit in something like that?
Yeah. So here's one. So I think a lot of people have senses of what these are that I disagree with. Like one of them is like that it may be right that, say, animal rights becomes a big thing in the future. Like in the future, it is viewed as evil to eat animals or whatever. But that doesn't seem to me to be a very radical transformation, in the sense that could just become, there's just a thing that a lot of people are doing now that more people could be doing. But here's one that I think is a radical one that maybe I'm wrong about it, but I think that something we've gone back and forth on as a culture is like, how okay is it to break bonds of friendship and love? So if I'm dating someone, say, and then I don't feel like dating them anymore, I can break up with them. Or suppose my parents are kind of annoying. I'm an adult and I don't feel like dealing with them. Maybe I see them as toxic. We right now, we're at a point in our culture where we see the breaking off of relationships as just like totally morally okay, basically under all circumstances. We're very permissive about that, except for parent and child going that like towards my own children. That would be heavily sanctioned. But otherwise, if I want to divorce my husband, if I want to break up with my best friend, if I want, it's like, that's just the world we live in is a world in which that's totally permissible. I suspect that in the future that will not be true.
But it wasn't true in the past, right?
Right. I think we've swung too far. I think that like we have, like we kind of, it's almost like we drunk a little bit on this idea of totally elective formation of attachments. And I think that there's something right about that. But that we have underrated how significant those attachments are once they have been formed, even if you should have agency in forming them. And there are these lifelong wounds that we inflict on ourselves and other people when we break up. And so it's not so much that I think we'll live in a world in which divorce is impossible. I think divorce will always be possible. I think divorce is a great thing. We should have it. But I think it'll be more like, you can't just cut someone out of your life. Like, that's not a thing you're just allowed to do. Like, you have, once you're in a relationship with someone, in some sense, you have certain kinds of duties and connections to that person forever. And you have to work through the breakup in a way that is like okay to both of you, except under terrible circumstances. So that's a moral change that I sort of envision, a change in our moral sensibilities of like how free we are in relation to one another.
It's very interesting because I've found that humans are so averse to conflict that they would prefer to abscond from a relationship rather than actually confront it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one place, I think we've become more averse to conflict, I suspect, because as our relationships have become more elective, right? So it's like you can choose to affiliate with people where there's a low conflict. And then part of the problem is that there are some people where we can't make a choice, like our fellow countrymen, right? Most of us don't choose what country we live in. And so you end up in these political struggles where there might be like two political groups and they like can't get along and they can't break up because we're not going to have two countries. And so
and you're about to leave the planet too. So you guys are going to have to stick together somehow.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see if we manage it. But I think that there are many, many people with whom you have to be able to get along. And like in the first instance, it's like your fellow countrymen. And so kind of training to get along with like the person who happens to be your sister or your neighbor or your spouse or your ex-spouse, that like, and learning to manage the conflicts and to be in them and to think that they're not the end of the world. I think that humanity has a lot of learning to do on that front.